Actually, it seems a little bit strange after all the other speeches. This is going to be very, very heavy in facts, and so it'll be right at the global level. So we'll be looking at the state of peace globally. We're a global organisation headquartered here in Australia, got office in New York, Brussels, Philippines, Mexico City, and a number of other representative offices in different parts of the world. Great, we're away. In our area, we're the leading think tank in the world. So we engaged, last year we had over 70 billion media impressions globally, and that was from about 23,000 different news articles globally. Works used in many universities around the world, do a lot of public speaking events, and last year we were referenced in over 2,000 different academic articles which were done for research. Perform a lot of work for places like the World Bank, UN, Commonwealth Secretariat, OECD, and many, many more. And the reports are extensively used. Millions of them get downline loaded each year. We've got a global network of ambassadors, about 6,500 now, bringing on about 1,000 a year. And we've got over 250,000 people who've actually trained on our work. And last year there would have been projects, some of them very small, in over 150 countries globally. So let's come back and we'll just now have a quick look at global peace. So there's 4 different themes we can see coming through this year. So the first thing is the concept of the geopolitical fragmentation. So you'll all be familiar with that, but I'm going to come into more on that as we move further on. It's the highest since the end of the Second World War, and that doesn't necessarily come as any surprise. But what we're seeing is that the growing influence is not so much as we move forward China or the US, which is where everyone's focused. It's really these rising middle-level powers. And many people in the audience will come from some of those countries, but I'll come more to that. China is probably, in the measures we've got, at its peak of influence now. This movement of China is not a force which is impossible to stop moving forward. We look at conflicts at a record level. There are 59 active state-based conflicts. That's the most since the end of the Second World War. And there are reasons behind that, which I'll come to. There are 7, we now focus on Gaza and we focus on the Ukraine. But there are 17 countries with more than 1,000 deaths recorded in conflict. And when we look at it, there are 78 countries now involved in a war beyond their borders, which many times, even if the local participants wanted to stop, they couldn't because of the outside engagement. Sudan would be one of those examples. And if we move on, we can also see militarisation increasing. Now, what none of you will know, if we'd gone back for the last 17 years, up to 2 years ago, the average militarisation of a country globally was actually decreasing. It was decreasing. More countries were coming less. Now, that reversed 2 years ago. But when we look at this also, although military expenditure is now skyrocketing, we're finding the money being spent on peace is decreasing. So the actual expenditure is down 34%, and the number of peacekeepers are down 42%. But if you want peace, if you really want peace, how do you get peace if you don't actually invest in it? You can't, can you? You really can't. So that brings us on, moves us further on. So now, this will give you an idea of just the changes in peace over the last 17 years. So this line goes up on these graphs, that's bad. So as we look at it, peace deteriorated 13 of the last 17 years. In fact, it's deteriorated every year since 2015. The main cause of that is conflict. But we focus on the negative. 87 countries deteriorated, but over that period, another 74 did actually improve. So let's have a look at Australia, just have a look at it quickly. So Australia is really ranked 18th in the world. That's ranked as a highly peaceful nation. And since 2020, it's actually fallen 4 places, although it did rise 1 place last year, but it'll probably still fall further as its military expenditure increases. Now, the falls were really due with external relations and a drop in its contributions to peacekeeping funding. Now, if we look at the domains, 3 domains within the Global Peace Index, if we're looking at safety and security, militarisation, over the longer period they have improved, but ongoing conflict has gone up, and this will give you an idea when we look at Australia's score as well. So now if we look at, these are the 17 countries globally which have got over 1,000 conflict deaths. And so a number of those countries you'll recognise. In fact, probably all of them you recognise as a conflict country, but you don't actually bring it together in your head as just how bad the situation actually is. And again, this will just give you an idea of the changes in conflict. So globally, if you hadn't had the increase in conflict, the world would have actually become more peaceful. So globally, would you believe, violent crime and homicides is actually decreasing. In fact, from many angles, the world is becoming more peaceful. So now I'm just going to come back to what we call the Great Fragmentation. So we've got a lot of research going on this. And so this is what we believe is the biggest change which is occurring now and will happen over the next decade. And it's not necessarily the rise of China. So we went back to the end of the Cold War, 1991. There were 14 countries with significant influence in another country. That had risen to 34 by 2023. Countries such as Turkey, Czechia, India, South Africa, Hungary had no influence in another country if we went back to 1991. Today, all of them have influence in over 10 other countries. And traditional powers like the UK, France, and we can see it's now starting to occur with other European powers as well, their influence is actually dropping. So now the US still remains the most influential, that's followed by China. However, we can see the superpowers' influence has peaked, and we'll see it slowly drop away. So these middle-level powers are going to rise because they're the ones with the rising GDP per capita growth. Now, if you're looking at China, its debt's 300% of GDP. That's exactly the same where Japan was in the 1990s. And we could see with Japan, actually, it then went flat. Its influence actually did not increase, and we did always thought at that point it was going to dominate the world. But more strikingly, the 300% debt is that China's foreign direct investment in the last 3 years has dropped 95%. 95%. So that, a lot of that is money not coming from the US and the money coming from Europe, because they've been the 2 big foreign direct investors. Now, this just gives you an idea of 4 countries: China, India, Turkey, Australia. In Australia. Now, this is 1991. They're the changes up to 2023. You see the massive explosion of China. You can see India has also increased quite a lot as well. And we can see the same influence with Australia. Evidently, Australia's influence is really just within its region. Now, if we looked at India, it's ranked now 115 on the Global Peace Index. That's actually an improvement of 17 places in the last 6 years. Now, it's done well on a lot of indicators, but the one indicator which it's really fallen on is state suppression, okay, which is considered a terror scale by some. So it's fairly low on that. It's fairly low on that. If you look at the region, like South Asia, for example, Nepal is ranked at 76, Sri Lanka is ranked at 97, India, as mentioned, 115, Pakistan 44, and Afghanistan 158. So we go back over the last 6 years, Afghanistan has increased, India's increased, Pakistan just slightly, but Nepal and Sri Lanka have both fallen. Now, violence comes with a cost. We do an estimation on this, and we've had multiple Secretary Generals, the UN, quote these stats year after year. So the cost of global GDP to the economy last year was 11.6% of GDP. So to put it in perspective, that's about $20 billion. That's 2,455 for every person on the planet. But the poorest countries in the world, the ones with the worst ecologies, are all in conflict zones. So now, if you've got the poorest people living in conflict zones, now there are over 40 countries, and they're the conflict countries of the world, where the per capita income is less than 2,455. So much of the poverty of the world would be solved if you could just solve the big conflicts. Now, just to give you an idea of some of the costs, if we're looking at the Ukraine, nearly 70% of its GDP has been lost per annum through the conflict. We can see the Afghanistan's over 50%, and that's each year. You look at the really peaceful countries, and the economic cost in Ireland, for example, which is one of the most peaceful countries, is about 2%. Australia's running at about 6 to 7%. Now, just quickly, we'll just spend a little bit on terrorism and we'll move on. So this will give you an idea of just the spread of terrorism globally. The red spots are where you've got the various terrorist attacks globally. And so this will give you an idea of the countries which have got the highest incidence of terrorism. Now, what you'll find is every one of them is in a conflict zone. Every country is in conflict. 98% of all terrorist deaths actually occur in a conflict zone. They don't occur outside of it. So the best way of being able to solve it is terrorism is really about to solve conflict. And you'll see in a few minutes just the way that attack that falls into here. So now if we're looking in the West, what we found last year is that the number of terrorist instances, the number of countries which are affected by terrorism jumped from 58 to 66. Now, what we find now is a lot of that jump has been in Western countries. So we've now got 7 countries, Western countries, are now in the worst 50 countries for terrorism globally. Now, ooh, how about that? That wasn't me. So if we start to look at it now, what we find in the West is that 98% of terrorist attacks are from lone actors. If we went back a decade ago, a lot of them would have been associated with groups like Al-Qaeda or Islamic State. Today, they're individuals who are actually radicalising alone, and that makes it very, very hard to actually find them. So the number of attacks actually peaked in 2017 and then decreased every year up to 2024. Last year, it was up 60% to 52 attacks. So it's on the rise again, and the early speakers earlier on talking about some of the issues here in Australia, that's a byproduct of this process. Anti-Semitic and Islamophobic instances have surged since the start of the Gaza war in both Europe, US and Australia. So now, in the 2 months after the start of the Gaza war, anti-Semitic incidents were up 270%. But in that same period, Islamophobic events were up over 300%. Now, only 8% of the attacks in the West are carried out as a group. If we went back to 2002, on average it was 16 months for someone to radicalise online. By 2015 it was 10 months. Today, because of the modern social media, you can see it can actually happen in a matter of weeks. And that'd be an example of the attack we saw in the US in Utah just a couple of days ago. A lot of the time, they're people who are isolated. They've got a dislike for society, quite often mental health issues, lack of meaning and purpose, got grievances, and often lack opportunity. And quite often, they see it as giving them a sense of purpose, the actual attacks. And the ways they radicalise are diverse. So in the UK also, in the West, we're also seeing they're becoming younger. So in the UK, 42% of the tax last year were for kids under 18. In Europe, it was 1 in 5. And you'll find a similar sort of thing happening here. And it's really difficult for the intelligence service to uncover this. It's happening quicker. Minimal footprint. They're loners, so they're not actually talking to a lot of people, so they're radicalised alone. And with groups, a lot of the time you can find them through their funding, but the individuals don't do funding. They're self-funded, so very, very hard to get at. All right, let's look at something positive. What creates peace? So I've got the Global Peace Index. We've done research where we analyse about 50,000 different data sets, do statistical analysis to work out, and then mathematical modelling to work out what's created with peace. And it's a concept called positive peace. It's holistic in nature, so it's systemic. It consists of 8 different pillars. I'm not going to run through the pillars here now. But once you do the analysis, you also find the same thing which creates peace, creates a lot of other things which we think are important. So, for example, higher per capita income. Countries improving in positive peace compared to countries deteriorating have twice the GDP growth per annum. The societies are more resilient. So as we move through COVID, the countries with high positive peace bounce back much faster after COVID than countries with low positive peace. Environmental conditions, better outcomes on environmental conditions. Higher measures of well-being and happiness. In fact, the correlation on that's about 0.93, which is exceptionally high. And you get better performance on development. So in many ways, positive peace describes an optimal environment in which human potential can flourish. Now, if we look at all the major religions, what you'll find is they all have messages of peace. So we've done a lot of analysis, worked back, and been able to take that positive peace architecture and now look at the underlying foundations with each of the different religions for those tenets, those 8 pillars. Now, I'm just going to hit one, otherwise it'd be a lengthy presentation going through all this, but I'll just take acceptance of the rights of others, because that's one of the cornerstones of peace. So in Hinduism, you got the Princess of Lashima, of non-harm, universal soul, Atman. Religion, you've got the emphasis on equality, people of the book. Buddhism, universal compassion, all beings equal in suffering. Christianity, love thy neighbour, dignify all. Judaism, human dignity, central, legal protections for minorities. So that, my friends, is the end of a very, very fast-moving presentation. And so a little bit different than what all the other speakers have said. It's the world captured within my hands. So, look, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Steve.
For all types of criminal law, family law, immigration law, conveyancing, and employment matters, please contact Tarandeep Singh on 0470 412 600.